They say the Mafia was born in Sicily. That's what the documentaries, the movies, and the textbooks tell you. But there's an older story, almost forgotten, that begins not in Sicily, but in Spain. A story about a secret brotherhood of thieves and killers that claimed the Virgin Mary herself had blessed their crimes. A group so feared that when its archives were allegedly uncovered in the 1800s, officials said they'd been operating for 300 years, leaving a trail of robberies, kidnappings, arson, and murder stretching back to the time of the Inquisition. Some called it a myth. Others whispered that the Mafia simply learned the business from them. They were called La Garduña, Spain's supposed 400-year murder brotherhood. This is Cult Files, and tonight, the question isn't just whether the Garduña really existed the way legend claims. It's whether their story shows us how religious fanatics, corrupt officials, and professional criminals can fuse into something that looks very much like a cult, armed not with doctrine, but with knives. To find the roots of the Garduña, you have to go back to a Spain that barely resembles the postcards. Late medieval Iberia was a patchwork of Christian and Muslim kingdoms locked in a centuries-long struggle. On the Christian side, the Reconquista was preached as a holy war. Banners of saints on the battlefield, indulgences for those who fought, sermons framing every skirmish as God's work. According to the later legends, this is where the Garduña began. The story says that 3 Spanish knights, disgraced for killing a noble during a quarrel, fled into the Sierra Morena mountains to hide. Alone, hunted, and desperate, they were said to be on the edge of despair when an old hermit appeared to them in a cave near Córdoba. Some versions name him Apolinario. He listened to their confessions, then offered them a choice: repent and live as humble penitents, or use their skills for a higher, if darker, purpose. The hermit told them that Spain was full of enemies, Moors, heretics, corrupt lords, and that God needed men willing to do the work polite society could not admit to. He allegedly forged them into the first nucleus of a brotherhood, an invisible army that would steal from those branded as enemies, assassinate targets too sensitive for open justice, and enforce a code of loyalty so strict that betrayal meant death. In return, he promised them spiritual protection. Their sins, he implied, would be counted as service. It's hard to know how much of this origin story is fact and how much is retroactive myth. The earliest detailed accounts of La Garduña we have come from the 19th century, long after the events they describe. But whether or not the hermit existed, the legend reveals something important about how Spaniards imagined organized crime, not just as greed, but as a twisted outgrowth of religious and political violence. In these stories, the Garduña's first members blended the roles of bandit, executioner, and holy warrior. They robbed travelers on lonely roads, ambushed convoys, and punished those marked as enemies by powerful patrons. They didn't present themselves as common thieves. They claimed to be instruments. Over time, the legend says, this mountain brotherhood drifted from crusade to crime. When the Reconquista ended, and there were no more Muslim strongholds to attack, its members didn't simply retire. They adapted. The same skills that made them effective irregular fighters: stealth, intimidation, use of terrain, and willingness to do what others would not, made them valuable in peacetime to a different set of masters. This is where the Garduña's story intersects with one of the darkest institutions in Spanish history, the Inquisition. The Inquisition officially handled doctrinal purity, rooting out heresy, Judaism, Islam, and later Protestantism. But any large institution needs local muscle. And most versions of the Garduña story say that at some point the Brotherhood began doing dirty work for inquisitors, bishops, and noble patrons who wanted problems solved without official fingerprints. The accusations paint a clear picture. If a witness was about to testify against someone powerful, he might be found knifed in an alley. If a family resisted confiscation of their property, their barn might mysteriously burn at night. If a heretic escaped the dragnet, someone would track him across the countryside and make sure he never reached safety. Officially, these were crimes. Unofficially, they were seen as useful, even pious. In exchange, members of La Garduña supposedly enjoyed a unique kind of privilege, practical immunity. If a Garduño was arrested for robbery or assault, the story goes, a word from the right confessor or official could make the charges vanish. Not every time, and not for every member, but often enough to create the impression that the Brotherhood was protected from above. That sense of invincibility is the oxygen any criminal organization needs. Inside the group, we're told, the structure was surprisingly formal. Initiates swore an oath in a darkened chapel or hidden room, often before an image of the Virgin Mary or a crucifix. They promised to obey superiors without question, to avenge any betrayal, and to prefer death over cooperating with authorities. The ceremony sometimes included symbols borrowed from both Christian liturgy and outlaw brotherhoods. A dagger laid on a Bible, the sharing of bread and wine that tasted more like a parody of communion than a sacrament. Ranks, according to 19th century descriptions, ranged from petty thieves and informers at the bottom to floridors, the seasoned hitmen who carried out serious tasks with knives or garrots, and finally a grand master who coordinated networks across multiple cities. Whether this hierarchy ever existed exactly as described is debatable. But once again, the legend tells us how people imagined the Brotherhood. Not as a loose gang, but as a structured, almost monastic order devoted to crime. The geography of their alleged operations was Andalusia and La Mancha, places like Seville, Córdoba, Toledo. These were regions where trade, wealth, and social tension overlapped. Caravans of silver moved from the interior to ports. Merchants, clergy, and officials traveled dangerous roads. Rural poverty rubbed shoulders with urban ostentation. If you were running a protection racket, this was fertile ground. In Seville, especially, the Garduña were said to control entire neighborhoods after dark. Shopkeepers paid them to look after their stalls. Travelers hired their protection to cross risky districts. Prostitutes, gamblers, and petty criminals worked under their watchful eye. In some accounts, even a few judges and constables belonged to the Brotherhood, feeding it information and shielding it from serious consequences. What separated La Garduña from mere banditry in the stories wasn't just scale. It was the way they wrapped their violence in ritual and justification. A mugger on a road was a criminal. A Garduño ambushing the same traveler could claim he was enforcing an unwritten tax, punishing a sinner, or answering an insult to the honor of the Brotherhood. The act was the same. The meaning, inside their world, was not. Every cult, religious or criminal, needs a narrative. For La Garduña, that narrative combined religious imagery, ancestral tradition, and a sense of being chosen. Members supposedly referred to themselves as the Blessed, and sometimes invoked the Virgin of their legendary origin story as a kind of patroness. They were not ashamed of their crimes. They saw them as work, hard, dangerous, but necessary and sanctified by custom. For centuries, if you believe the 19th century writers, this shadow system coexisted with official Spain. It changed with the times. During the height of the Inquisition, it leaned into religious enforcement. During periods of political turmoil, it sold its services as a private army. In quieter times, it focused on extortion, smuggling, and hired killing. All the while, it passed down its initiation rites, its oaths, and its code of silence. Then came the crack in the legend, the supposed fall of La Garduña in 1822. According to the most famous version of the story, the beginning of the end came with a murder that went wrong. A woman in Seville, the lover of a Garduña member, was killed, some say by mistake, others say as punishment for disobedience. Her death drew more attention than usual. Local authorities investigated more aggressively than expected, and a low-level member, under pressure, began to talk. What the police claimed to find when they followed his information reads like the dream of any crime historian. Not just a nest of criminals, but an archive. In a hidden room, they allegedly discovered registers of members, records of crimes going back to the 16th century, lists of payments from unnamed benefactors, and evidence of coordination across multiple provinces. In other words, proof that La Garduña had been operating as a structured organization for 300 years. The investigation, again according to these accounts, culminated in the arrest of the then Grand Master, a man named Francisco Cortina. In a dramatic public trial in Seville, witnesses testified to a culture of murder, arson, and robbery managed under the banner of the Brotherhood. The court sentenced Cortina and 16 other leaders to death. They were hanged in the city square as a warning. Others received long prison sentences or were exiled. It's a satisfying climax, almost too perfect. The secret Brotherhood exposed, its leaders executed, the archives seized, the line of succession broken. Newspapers and pamphlets of the time embellished the story, portraying the Garduña as a medieval relic finally purged by enlightened modern justice. For readers, it was both terrifying and reassuring. Terrifying because it hinted at a long-running conspiracy in their midst. Reassuring because the state at last had won. But did it happen this way? Here's where the story of La Garduña becomes even more interesting. Modern historians who have gone looking for the court records, the archives, and the hard details have found far less than you might expect. Some of the supposed documents appear to originate not from legal files, but from a sensationalist 19th century book called The Mysteries of the Inquisition and Other Secret Societies of Spain. That text, popular in its day, blended fact with fiction, dramatizing events for readers hungry for Gothic thrills. The author portrayed the Garduña as almost omnipotent, with their hands in every dark deed in Spain for centuries. Yet he offered few verifiable citations. Later writers borrowed his narrative, added local legends, and treated the whole as history. As a result, La Garduña occupies a strange space, well known in occult and secret society literature, poorly documented in archival research. Some scholars now argue that if there was a group called La Garduña, it was likely a much smaller and more local criminal network that later acquired legendary status. Others think the entire thing might be a literary construction, perhaps inspired by real bandits, but inflated into a proto-mafia to satisfy the tastes of the time. And yet the story continues to be repeated, not just in fringe books, but sometimes in discussions of organized crime. Why? Because it fits a pattern we recognize. The idea of a centuries-old brotherhood that mixes religious language, rigid hierarchy, and ruthless violence resonates with what we know about later organizations, the Sicilian Mafia, the Camorra, the 'Ndrangheta, and others. In fact, some accounts of La Garduña go further, claiming that members fleeing the 1822 crackdown migrated to Italy and seeded those groups. There is no solid evidence for this migration, but as a narrative, it is compelling. It offers a neat origin story. Before Cosa Nostra, there was La Garduña. Whether or not that is true, the legend performs an important function. It pushes the idea of organized crime backward in time, embedding it in the religious wars, social inequalities, and judicial terrors of early modern Spain. It suggests that mafias do not spring up from nowhere. They grow out of the cracks in societies where official power is both feared and corrupt, where people seek protection from and against the authorities at the same time. Seen through that lens, La Garduña, real or exaggerated, embodies the logic of a cult. It offers belonging to the marginalized and ambitious, demands absolute loyalty, uses sacred symbols to justify profane acts, and operates in the shadows with its own rules. Its members see themselves not as criminals, but as an alternative order. For cult files, the question is less, did every detail of the story happen exactly as written? And more, what does the popularity of the story reveal? It shows how deeply people suspect that behind courts, churches, and states, there is always another structure, a secret one, doing the work polite society won't admit to. It's the same suspicion that feeds modern conspiracy theories about deep states and hidden cabals. Today, if you walk through the old quarters of Seville or Toledo, you will not find plaques marking the houses of La Garduña. There is no museum of their crimes, no preserved headquarters with tourist tickets. What you will find are narrow alleys, old churches, former Inquisition offices turned into archives or museums, and countless stories. Some are documented. Others live only in the gap between fear and imagination. Somewhere in that gap walks the figure of the Garduño, knife under cloak, prayer on lips, convinced that he is both sinner and chosen instrument. Whether he was ever as powerful as the legends claim, the fact that we still talk about him centuries later means the Brotherhood achieved something remarkable. It became a myth big enough to stand beside the institutions it supposedly served and infiltrated. In the end, La Garduña may be both less and more than its legend. Less because the specific claims of a 400-year, nationwide murder brotherhood are probably exaggerated. More because, as an idea, it captures the messy overlap of faith, power, and crime in a way that feels disturbingly familiar. And if you believe the darker versions, then somewhere between mountain caves, Inquisition cells, and the back rooms of Andalusian taverns, Spain gave the modern world something it would spend the next 2 centuries fighting, a blueprint for organized murder wrapped in the language of loyalty and honor. If you want the truth about mafias, you can follow the paper trails and police reports. But if you want to understand why people keep inventing stories like La Garduña and sometimes living by them, you have to look into the shadows where law, religion, and crime shake hands. That's where the real brotherhoods are born.